Welcome to the Glassworking shop. Well, I'm back to making videos again after about 3 months off. I remodeled the shop, moved a bunch of stuff around, installed my new Haas mini mill, did NQALHA production run 5, and finally I have a little time to get back out in the glassworking shop and do some glass work. So I'm going to be continuing here a project that I started a while ago. I think I made the video, trying to remember. I videoed the first version of this design. It's a design kind of inspired by the blacksmithing technique of Damascus, where they stack together bunches of different alloys of steel and then heat them and form them together and make an object out of it. So I'm kind of doing the same thing with glass, making some colored glass rectangle shapes that I stick together and press and squeeze and triangularize and turn into a triangular shape, which I then cut up, assemble into a hexagon, and call it macaroni. So the first one, as I said before, the first one I made a video series of. The second one I did in bits and pieces here and there and didn't video. And now I'm back trying to do videos again. So I'm continuing to experiment with camera settings because hot glass is difficult to photograph, I tell you. So anyway, hopefully I remember how to do all of this. Glass is very much a use it or lose it kind of situation, and I'm a little out of practice, so let's see how I do. I'm going to get started here. I'm going to be making a pulled piece of rectangular flat glass, and the final piece that I need to make is going to be about a little over 1 1/8 inches wide by a little under 1/4 inch thick, and I need to get 2 usable pieces out of the pull of 3.5 inches each. And so I usually pull about 8.5 inches, 8.5, 9 or so I get a useful yield out of the nice part in the center. So I'm going to start getting ready here. I'm going to build the thing on a 19mm solid punty, and going to build it out of North Star canary yellow rod, and then that will be striped on the outside. After it's wadded up into a cylinder, it'll be striped on the outside with North Star jet black, and then squeezed into a flat shape and pulled to length. So I need to readjust the squeezer, and this gives me a chance to demonstrate here how the quick disconnect feature works on the squeezer. This is the first prototype squeezer, and of course it's been through, I don't even know how many, but it's been through many, many evolutions. So it's probably not fair to call it the first prototype. It's really more like the 5th or 6th version of the first prototype. But I have a project in mind I'm going to start fairly soon, which is Prototype 2. Or actually possibly even release candidate 1, but at the moment I'm going to call it Prototype 2 of the squeezer. Going to build a completely new one based on everything that I've learned so far, and who knows, may even offer it for sale. I have absolutely no idea if there's a market for it. I have no idea how much I'd have to sell it for. But anyway, I'm going to make another one just because I like making things. So here I have replaced the hexagonal iris dies with a pair of flat parallel dies in preparation for squeezing. And I like keeping a clean bench. I know that some glassworkers, for one reason or another, they have just this enormous pile of crap and it looks like they're working in a trash dump. And, well, you know, whatever works for you. But for me, I kind of like a clean bench with only the minimum amount of stuff that I'm going to be using for the operation to be performed, and everything else over here on the side, I don't know if you can see it real well in the camera, but I have a steel rack with stainless shelves so I can put hot tools in it without any danger of setting anything on fire. And so I like to keep all of my tools to my right so I can easily get the tool I need without having to clutter up the bench with stuff I don't need. So I'm going to start off here, put the 19mm punty in the NQALHA. And probably need to turn my gas on. So I'm going to start out by wadding up a color rod on the end of the punty, which I will then shape into a nice cylinder. And once it's all nicely cylindrical, get the end worked out here a little bit. Once it's all nicely cylindrical, I'll stripe it with a black color rod. And then proceed to squeeze and pull into the final rectangular shape. So, just putting a little handle here, putting a little handle on the color rod. I'm going to be using a somewhat oxidizing, somewhere between neutral and oxidizing flame. Oh, that was an odd little thing. A little piece of the color rod just jumped off the end. I'm somewhat preheating the end of my punty, and then I'm fairly gently heating this cadmium color because cadmium colors are pretty sensitive to boiling, and so the combination of working in the far flame and using a neutral to slightly oxidizing flame kind of minimizes the boiling. So all I'm doing is just preheating the rod, trying to wad it up in the most uniform pattern that I can. Of course, it doesn't matter, but still, even when it doesn't matter, it's nice to practice, just to get practice doing the best I can, even if it's not necessary. So most of the heat goes on the part of the rod that isn't in contact with the mass that I'm developing. And as I'm doing this, I'm rotating with the right hand, which is another good thing to practice, even though this particular operation doesn't require precise right-hand synchronization. Doesn't hurt at all to add a little twist to the color rod as it's melting into place. It's still, like I said before, it's a good idea to practice things. Even if I don't need to get it right, it's a good idea to practice, because for other projects at other times I will need to get it right. So, very carefully looking at the glass, making sure that I don't see any bubbles, don't see any boiling. I have the twist axis on the NQALHA locked off, so when I grab it and release the magnets, all I'm getting is horizontal motion, which doesn't really take any effort. I don't need to actually hold on to it and grab it to keep it under control. So, I'm doing pretty good. I get an occasional little sparkle that looks like, oh, it might be a little bubble, but mostly I believe I'm getting a nice clean, air-free, melted in little cylindrical shape. So try to keep as much of the color as I can. And now I'm going to switch to the Delta Mag flame. And I really like the Delta Mag torch, not necessarily because I want a super hot flame, but because a larger flame covers more area more uniformly, and kind of nice to be able to cover the entire thing that I'm making here. And yes, the result is coming out nice and smooth. Now I'm moving to the more dangerous end, and when I say dangerous, well, the NQALHA is a single-sided lathe, and there's nothing supporting this end. So as I start getting it hotter, it's going to want to droop. So and there we go. So stop, let it droop, restart. Early in the development of the project, it was suggested that I put the foot pedal control so the foot pedal can do pause and reverse to control drooping. So when you have a drooped object, you let it go until the droop is facing up, then push the pedal to pause, push the pedal to reverse after it's fallen back into place, and therefore control the droop. Well, turns out that that's not as useful as I thought it would be, and that just after after using the machine for a while, it's better just to use the start-stop button to control droop. Seems to do a better job. Notice that the clamp mechanism on the NQALHA is held in place with a little magnet up here, and I was able to work the lever with one hand as I removed the workpiece. So now I'm going to switch to handwork, and as much as I love the NQALHA and as useful of a tool as it is, it's a handwork assistant. You really don't do the entire project on the NQALHA. Some things, especially when the piece starts getting really loose and out of control, I find are just a little more convenient to do with handwork. And of course, the question of when to handwork and when to use the NQALHA is not an easy question to answer, and I don't claim to have all the answers. I think each individual glassworker is going to decide when the NQALHA is useful and when they feel more comfortable doing it by hand. So now I've created a very nice, very smooth little cylindrical chunk here that is almost ready to go. Okay, so that, nice and smooth and clean and uniform, the thing of beauty. So I'm going to go back to the NQALHA and release the twist axis and get it into position for striping. I like doing striping on the NQALHA. A lot of guys, the standard way of doing this work is to do it at the bench torch and hold the workpiece in one hand and the color rod in the other hand and do your striping. And yes, it works, and glassworkers get excellent results doing it. I tend to find the NQALHA to be more comfortable for me. It makes more sense for the way I do things. It feels more like welding, using a hand torch with the NQALHA. Now I'm intentionally letting the substrate cool a little bit, because if I stripe on this cylinder when the cylinder is too hot and get maybe a little too aggressive pushing in the color rod, you can end up making divots, and I certainly don't want divots in this piece. So I'm now applying most of the heat to the part of the color rod that's not right at the surface. In a reverse direction here. Kind of preheating the rod. Very little of the heat actually goes onto the surface that I'm striping on. I'm mostly preheating the rod, preheating the edge of where I'm striping onto, because I want the stripes as I lay them down to totally fill up that little acute angle that's left as a result of the previous stripe, so I don't have any trapped air. Get a nice fuse and not overheat the substrate. The only thing the substrate is getting is a little bit of the spill from the torch. so that I get a nice clean striped surface. Try to make it as uniform as I can. Try to keep the stripes the same thickness, as parallel as I can. If I start getting out of control, I can regain control by changing my speed. If the stripe needs to be thicker, I just slow down a little. If it needs to be thinner, I speed up a little. So far they're looking very nice, very uniform, very parallel. Got to make sure when I'm doing this to not set anything on fire as I move the hand torch out of the way to grab the rod holder. Don't want it pointing at anything to catch on fire, so got to be aware of everything in the glassworking shop. And of course I realize that some glassworkers may look at this and say, "That's crazy, dude, I'd never do it that way." Fine, use the tool whatever way you think is best for you and whatever you're comfortable with. For me, this feels more comfortable. It feels more like welding. And because I'm a welder, it just feels more natural. The traditional method of working with a bench torch kind of almost feels like trying to do a painting with the paintbrush clamped in a vise and moving the canvas. I'm gonna knock off some of these little nubbins here. Return to rotation mode. Lock off the twist axis. Get that stub of the rod put away. Keep my table nice and clean. And then I'm going to start smoothing out the little nubbins at the end of the stripe. Form acute angles, and glass does not like acute angles. There's nothing cute about acute angles. If a crack is going to form, it's going to form right at an acute angle. So it's important to get those little nubbins knocked off to avoid getting a crack started on that end. So now, just rotating slowly, I've got the Delta Mag flame turned down pretty low because I don't want a fire-breathing dragon. I don't want an intense amount of heat. I want a moderate amount of heat spread over a larger area so that I don't boil my color. The jet black is a lot more forgiving in terms of boiling, so I really don't have that much of a problem. I'm going to reverse direction here. Even though the thing that I'm making is just a bullseye, and so twist doesn't matter at all, it's good to practice the way you control twist on the NQALHA is by reversing direction. And if I practice on pieces that don't matter, then when the time comes and I actually need to control twist in a more precise way, I'll have a little bit of practice, a little bit of experience. So starting at the easy end, working toward the difficult end, and just very gentle paddle pressure. Keep the paddle cool. Obviously, it gets more difficult to keep this thing under control as I get closer and closer to the difficult end. And of course, this is another great advantage to using the 19mm punty. It gives me a lot more stability and resistance to drooping than if I used a smaller punty. Now, traditionally, hand workers use small diameter punties. Let me stop, droop, return to center. Glassworkers typically use smaller punties. They use 10mm, 12mm, 9mm, sometimes 8mm, because it feels better in the hand. It feels better for manually spinning. A 19mm punty is somewhat unwieldy to spin by hand, but on the NQALHA, it just gives me more stability. So it's another example of how many of the traditional techniques are directly transferable to the NQALHA, and some, the NQALHA kind of leads you toward experimentation and unconventional techniques. So now I'm building a heat base, and for those of you who are watching who are not familiar with the language used by glass workers, glass is an insulator, and it takes a really long time. One of my teachers said, when the outside of the glass looks blistering hot, scorching hot, the inside is still cold. It takes a long time for the heat to travel from the outside into the inside, and if you get too aggressive, you boil the surface while the inside is still cold. But little bit by little bit, the heat does make it down to the center, and glass is somewhat nonlinear in its behavior. That once the glass starts becoming liquid, it conducts heat a whole lot better. So that results in your typical beginner mistake of heating, wow, is this taking a long time? And then all of a sudden overheating. So just slowly getting that core heat built up. It always takes longer than you think it will. Glasswork, one thing about glasswork, it really goes slow. And of course, that's another beginner mistake, which I know oh so well, far too well, that beginners want to get it over with quick. Too hot, too fast, too brutal. So I'm just slowly and gently trying to get that core to the point where the whole thing will squeeze uniformly. It's getting more difficult to control as it gets droopier. I'm also kind of using gravity here to elongate it a little bit and to keep it from drooping. So I think it's ready. Getting very hard to control, which tells me it's squeezing time. So here we go. And that's how it comes out, freshly squozen. So the next step, I'm going to be using gravity to rectangularize it a little bit, because this is the natural shape that it comes out like after being squozen. And using one of the few tools that we have. Glassworking, unlike machine work where you got many, many tools, glasswork only has a few. You got heat, you got gravity, you got air, you got a few basic graphite hand tools, paddles and squeezers and dies and things like that. There really is that there are very few tools that the glassworker has available. So here I'm using gravity and trying to get it to fall, keeping the sides parallel. So that substantially more parallel, going to give it just the slightest, barely touch it, squeeze on the squeezer. And of course that's another thing that along the road to my glassworking adventure, the one thing I noticed watching my teachers and watching other expert glassworkers is how gentle they are. And of course, the easiest beginner mistake is to be too brutal, to try to force it. And as I proceed down this path toward becoming a glassworker, I find that I'm getting more and more gentle as I go, achieving better and better results. So it's almost correctly rectangularized. The part right at the puntee is not going to be useful material, so I don't really care. So it is very, very close to being ready for pulling. When I started making these glass rectangles on the squeezer, one of the things that I learned was there are limits to how thin you can squeeze glass in a squeezer with graphite dies, because as soon as the glass hits the dies, it freezes. And you really can't get super thin with the squeezer because it almost instantly freezes as soon as it hits the dies. So that, I'm going to give it one more squeeze. And that is ready for pulling. So, nice thing about the NQALHA, you can just kind of park your piece on the NQALHA, keeping it hot. You can put it over a Bunsen, put it in the back flame of the bench torch, and just try to keep the piece hot as you prepare to do the next operation. So I've got a punty with, this is a 15mm punty, and I've got a kind of a slightly squished end on it that I've used before that I'm going to use as a puller. So, oh, well, that didn't work. Of course, I'm sure that a more experienced glass worker would say, dude, why'd you stick that cold glass into the Delta Mag flame? Probably should have put the punty in the kiln before attempting to use it, but no problem. I'll just make another one. And of course, while I'm doing this, I'm demonstrating that the NQALHA can be used to do two things at one time. So now I'm gathering up a little blob at the end of my rod, and at the same time in the far flame I'm keeping my piece hot. I could put it in the kiln, but then I end up having to get the kiln dust off it. So of course, this also gives a chance for me to show how to make my little flattened punty on the squeezer. Now as I get more and more ready to attach this guy, when I get the punty super hot and the end of my workpiece kind of hot enough but not insanely hot, then kind of like squish the punty around, make sure it's stuck well, and from this point onward it'll all be handwork. So now a thin piece loses its heat base in no time. A lot of surface area. So the right hand with the punty is already super hot. I'm going to focus my attention over on the left side. When pulling a piece of glass, the center tends to get hotter than the edges, and if you just heat what you think is uniform and then pull it, you end up with a really thin center and gigantic triangular or conical pieces on the ends called knuckles, and very little usable material in the center. So what I'm doing here, I'm trying to concentrate some heat on the ends. Of course, the goal is to have very uniform heat, but I find that when I concentrate on the ends, it kind of automatically heats the center. Just the spill from the torch automatically heats the center. So, little bit by little bit, I'm looking and I'm feeling how the glass is behaving. Is it starting to get loose? I'm starting to develop an inadvertent twist, which I don't want. But it will not be a problem. I'm going to start from the far end, and I am pulling so gently, almost no force at all. Almost like what they say about learning to hover a helicopter. Put your hand on the stick and don't move the stick, just think about moving the stick. And you'll get enough force to correct for the drift of the helicopter. I'm switching back and forth. I know that more experienced pullers, some of my teachers are just so amazingly good at pulling. Make it look easy. Make it look like magic. They do it a lot faster with a lot less steps. I'm still learning, still developing my skill, so I go slow and incremental. It's not a race. All that matters is the final result. I'm trying to get uniform, parallel sides, roughly 1.125 inches, a little over 1.125 inches, by a little under 1/4 thick. And when I take it out of the flame, I don't immediately start pulling. I give it just a couple of seconds to equalize, and then pull so slowly and so gently at first. And then, as I feel the glass stiffening up, I increase the pulling force and just try to keep the whole mess under control. Of course, the experts that have taught me would be done now and their piece would be perfect, but hey, it's all about learning, and for me it's all about the result. I don't care how long it takes. As long as it comes out, as long as I end up with a useful object in the end, it doesn't matter if I'm a lot slower. So, getting the end is challenging. So there we have, not perfect, but certainly is good enough. So just heating the clear. Clear is softer than color, and if you heat a piece of clear the same way you heat a piece of color, the clear will get very soft very fast, and the color will stay stiff. So cleaning up the ends a little bit, and there is the result. Off to the kiln. So I'm not going to show every single piece that I'm making for the prep. I'm going to show the entire assembly because the assembly is kind of interesting, but the prep is a lot of just rinse and repeat. So I have a number of other colors to make of these rectangles. The final assembly will be a set of 7, with the center being white, followed by yellow, orange, and red extending out from the center. And I'm not going to show making each one of those because it's all the same, only the color is different. So the next video is going to be more prep. It's going to be 7 rod stack prep. And then I think I've already shown that in previous videos, but now with the new camera setup, I want to see if the new camera setup does it a little bit better. Then after all the prep is done, I'm going to start putting the sucker together. So thanks for watching. It's been fun.